On behalf of FCSM and COPAS, I want to welcome everyone to our 7th of 8 webinars on confidentiality and data access. This one is entitled Disclosure in an Era of Administrative Records and Data Sharing. My name is Paul Schroeder, and I'm the Executive Director of COPAS. Each of these webinars were repurposed from the FCSM conference, initially scheduled for April of this year. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the COPAS website within the next week. I'm now going to turn it over to Michael Hawes from the Census Bureau, who is the chair of this session. Michael?
Great, thank you, Paul. And let me echo Paul in welcoming all of you on behalf of the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology and COPAS to this 7th installment of our Confidentiality and Data Access webinar series. And apologies, I'm not able to share video with you. There was something with my VPN that's not allowing it, but we will make do. So today's session will look at challenges and best practices when addressing disclosure risks associated with the growing use of administrative records and increasing data sharing between agencies. In previous webinars of this series, we've discussed how disclosure avoidance needs to be approached from the perspective of risk management and risk mitigation. We've also discussed how disclosure risks are increasing as third-party data increases and as new and more powerful machine learning algorithms are better able to leverage that external data to re-identify individuals in the data that our agencies publish. Central to our ability to counter these emerging threats is the need to consider disclosure avoidance holistically, looking at all releases of related data rather than reviewing each release of data individually. But how do you coordinate that when multiple agencies are using and releasing the same data? That's what we're going to be exploring today. Our speakers from the Internal Revenue Service, the National Center for Health Statistics, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the Office of Management and Budget will discuss the challenges that they face when considering these issues. And we'll discuss some approaches that they've found to successfully address them. Our speakers will each speak for about 10 minutes, after which we will have a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. So please submit your questions during the presentations via the chat box. I'll be compiling them during the talks, and then I'll pose them to the panelists during the Q&A. So without further ado, let me introduce our first panelist. Barry Johnson serves as the Internal Revenue Service's Acting Chief Research and Analytics Officer and as Director of the IRS Statistics of Income Division. During his almost 33 years with SOI, he's worked extensively on studies of the federal transfer tax system, the distribution of U.S. personal wealth, and issues related to data quality, data access, privacy protection, and the use of administrative data for statistical purposes. He is a fellow of the American Statistical Association. So take it away, Barry.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks everybody for being here today. It's an honor to be part of this panel. If we could go to the next slide. So the Statistics of Income Division's mission was created as part of the introduction of the modern federal tax system in 1916. So for the last 104 years, the IRS has produced annual reports on the tax system. And even in those earliest reports, that meant producing statistics for all major filing populations and stratifying that information by other characteristics such as geographic units, some measure of the level of income, industry, occupation, things like that. If you go back and look at some of those early reports, you'd be amazed at how detailed the tables were, especially considering they were all produced manually. Next slide, please. That tradition continues today, with SOI producing and releasing numerous tables and reports annually for nearly all IRS filing populations, including individuals, businesses, corporations, and nonprofits. This past fiscal year, the one that ended yesterday, we released more than 700 items on our web pages, and they were downloaded more than 15 million times. In addition to annual updates, the website has machine-readable files for most filing populations going back decades, and PDF copies going all the way back to 1916. These tables are used by researchers, the media, and the public, and can be used to evaluate current and proposed tax policies and for broader economic analysis. As noted on this slide, most SOI data releases rely on traditional disclosure limitation methods, threshold or dominance rules that result in cell suppression or some form of aggregation. We are making progress on modernizing our dissemination methods, including an upcoming release of a synthetic data file for low-income individuals as a first step toward a fully synthetic file representing the entire population of individual income tax filers. In addition, we've been working with the Department of Education to provide tabulated data that are protected using formal differential privacy methods. Next slide, please. Unlike many statistical agencies, SOI data are based almost exclusively on administrative records, that is, tax returns filed by the public to fulfill their tax obligation or information returns provided by third parties to report certain types of income. For the most part, we work with stratified statistical samples of tax returns, selected when returns are filed in order to produce our statistical files. This has allowed SOI over the years to develop a production model that largely replicates processes used to produce survey-based statistics. So while we start with information collected by the IRS for tax administration purposes, we have a large editing operations that add value in a number of ways, including correcting taxpayer errors, reorganizing the data to ensure consistency across all returns in the sample, coding demographic variables, and gathering additional information from attachments and schedules that are not captured during the processing of our paper-filed returns. There isn't time to go into it now, but it is worth noting that the quality of even electronically submitted tax returns varies significantly across populations. Most of us think of TurboTax or H&R Block when we think of electronically filed returns. These providers build a lot of tests into their products which ensure that the data that come to us are of fairly high quality. But for smaller filing populations, such as businesses and nonprofits, there aren't highly developed products that assist taxpayers in producing returns, which results in much lower quality administrative data for these filers. The quality of administrative data is probably a topic for another day, but I did want to just note that variation across returns. So next slide, please. So as Michael noted in his introductory remarks, modern discussions around processing confidential data recognize, or rather, as we noted in many of our previous seminars, modern discussions around protecting confidential data, recognizing that each use of statistical data file increases the risk of disclosure by a little. Thus, each data set has something like a fixed privacy budget, which can be predetermined based on how the data producer balances data quality and data access. Practically, this approach is appealing because when using a differential privacy approach to protect data, it can be quantified, but more generally, it provides an analogy that we can relate to. We all have experience working with budgets, and as an economist, I find it very useful in thinking in terms of maximizing utility or benefit given a particular budget constraint. And even outside applications of differential privacy, the analogy is useful. It's intuitive that the risk of a mosaic effect disclosure, that is a disclosure that occurs by combining information across multiple releases of the same data, will increase as we release more and more cuts of the same data. When an agency is the sole owner of a data set and can control all the uses of the data, mitigating this risk seems manageable, if technically challenging. So this slide lists the major users of administrative tax data. To start with, tax data are widely used by business units within the IRS for program operations and to report on those operations to stakeholders, including Congress and occasionally the public. So, for example, starting in late January of each calendar year, the IRS organization that processes individual income tax returns provides weekly reports on the number of returns they process, the number and amount of refunds that are processed, etc. With the recent economic impact payments, our Chief Financial Officer provided biweekly reports to Treasury and OMB on the number and amount of these payments, stratified by state, and they provided some of that information has been publicly disseminated as well. So in addition to the internal users, you can see that a number of agencies have access to tax microdata. Treasury and the JCT, the Joint Committee on Taxation, both use SOI statistical data files and the IRS administrative data for tax policy analysis and budget formation. Census Bureau uses tax data to support its economic and decennial programs and mingled with some of its own data for research. State tax authorities are allowed to ask for federal tax data provided by their citizens to use for policy and enforcement purposes. In addition, SOI produces special tabulations for other agencies to help with program administration and for statistical research. Next slide, please. So as you can see, protecting privacy when using administrative data is complicated by the number of stakeholders who have access to the data and to the many different purposes for which the data can be used. If we go back to our privacy budget framework, It's a little bit like trying to manage the family budget when members of the extended family, friends, and neighbors all have an ATM card to draw on the household account. So how do we minimize the risk of accidental disclosure of tax data given the large number of users? Well, first, we try to ensure that all users understand the risk and the consequences of an inadvertent disclosure of taxpayer information. We are aided by this with very strong civil and criminal penalties for intentional disclosures. Users who host tax data also undergo regular computer security inspections and take data protection training to heighten awareness. Second, we actively discourage data holders from publicly releasing extensive tabulations and instead try to collaborate broadly to try to ensure that our official statistical tables are meeting a broad range of needs. We also collaborate with some of our data stewards, for example, Census, Treasury, and some of the IRS offices, to try to reduce duplicative research efforts that might result in mosaic effect disclosures. We've even successfully encouraged separate teams of academic researchers to collaborate together. The SOI Disclosure Review Board also works with IRS, Treasury, and researcher outputs created from administrative data to reduce risks. The DRB also coordinates with the IRS Chief Privacy Officer to set minimum standards for tabular release of data that apply to all users of tax data, both those within the IRS and those outside the IRS. These are reported in IRS Publication 1075 and are updated periodically. While these are in no way state-of-the-art, they do ensure minimum standards are followed. It remains to be seen how effective this particular approach will be as methods for protecting tabular data become more and more statistically complex. Finally, we're working on alternatives to direct data access or tabular releases. For example, as I noted earlier, we're developing synthetic data sets that would substitute for some public microdata in some uses. The utility of synthetic data sets can be enhanced by coupling it with some sort of tiered access mode, such as a validation server. I won't say much about that now because I'm at the end of my time, and I think others may touch on it, but if not, we can come back to that later. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Barry. And if anyone has questions for Barry, please remember to type them into the chat window. I will be compiling them and asking them of the panelists at the end of the discussion. Turning to our second presenter today, Jennifer Maddens is the Acting Deputy Director of the National Center for Health Statistics and has been serving as the Center's Associate Director for Science since May of 1996. Jennifer is responsible for the overall plan and development of NCHS's data collection and analysis programs. Since Dr. Maddens joined the Center, she has concentrated her research efforts on data collection methodology, measurement of health and functioning and health services research. She's a founding member and has been the chair of the steering committee for 3 UN-sponsored initiatives to develop internationally comparable measures of disability and health, including the Washington Group on Disability Standards, a city group under the auspices of the UN Statistical Commission. Dr. Maddens is a graduate of Bard College and the University of Michigan. She is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and an elected member of the International Statistical Institute. And she served as vice president of the International Association of Official Statistics. Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to talk about a particular aspect of the use of administrative records and how that impacts on data sharing and trying to protect confidentiality through disclosure review, and that's a data linkage program. And I'm going to focus on the data linkage program at NCHS, but I think many of the characteristics of this program will apply to many of the other data linkage programs that are done throughout the federal statistical system. And I want to thank Lisa Merle for her help on this, and she is the person who runs our data linkage program at NCHS. Next slide, please. So as you'll see, the data linkage program that we've been running is long-standing, several decades, in fact. It starts with developing methodologies to link our survey data, and we have a broad family of surveys that we do at NCHS with administrative data from a variety of sources, and not only to develop the methodology to do this, but also to evaluate the quality of those linked files. We then create this resource, which is perfect for doing evidence-based policy research in the area of health and its determinants and consequences, and is often used to look at the effectiveness of policies and programs. These files are released with very clear and transparent methodological descriptions and analytic for researchers so that findings from the files can be reproducible. And then the cycle goes back, and we try to then develop new and better ways of doing the linkages and evaluating those linkages. And in the more recent times, this is done with an eye towards trying to further protect confidentiality, but to expand access to these very useful files, but very complicated files. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of what is involved in the linkages, we do, as I said, a large number of surveys. These are interview surveys, for example, a health interview survey, physical examination surveys, and we also do surveys of providers, and so we're getting patient records directly from them. And these surveys go back 50 years, some of them. We link the information from those surveys first to the mortality data that we collect from states as part of our data collection system. This gives you not only vital status, but also cause of death. And then right after we link to the mortality data, the next set of files historically that we link to were files from CMS. And these are Medicare and Medicaid files where you can get very detailed information on the utilization of services from the variety of providers that can bill through these payment mechanisms. And then we also will link to other administrative records from other departments, for example, from the Housing and Urban Development, and we're in negotiations with other departments as well. All of these are to get more information about the consequences of a health status, predictors of a health status, and any other thing that might be related to health. Now, not shown on this slide, but also done, are linkages with geographic-based information. So this could be information from the census on characteristics of census tracts or blocks, but also we get information from environmental monitors, such as clean water or air monitors. So you can see for any individual survey participant, we have a huge range of additional information about that person, and the adage of disclosure problems is the more information you have, the easier it is going to be to re-identify a person. So the linked files are very highly re-identifiable. Next slide, please. So as I said, our program goes back quite a way. We started doing record linkage with the National Health Interview Survey in the survey that was done in 1985. And those files have been linked through, in terms of the mortality outcomes, through 2015 and for Medicare and Medicaid data for the more recent years of the HIS. So starting with Medicare and Medicaid in 94 and so forth. The Haynes data, this is our examination survey, is also linked for mortality outcomes for Medicare, Medicaid, and HUD. And we have now started linking our provider surveys, the National Healthcare Survey. So here we're getting hospital records for our sample of persons that we can then also link to other aspects of their healthcare through the Medicare and Medicaid data. Next slide, please. So I think it's pretty clear that there will be a much more increased disclosure risk with these linked files. They're combining information from a variety of sources and combining a huge amount and sometimes very detailed information. You can imagine that the records that we're getting from providers, whether it's directly from the provider or through CMS, collect an awful lot of very detailed information. So you have the risk that's associated with the survey data itself, which has a large number of demographic characteristics on it, and then you have the risk associated with the administrative files, and you put them together, and you actually increase the risk of disclosure. And there's a particular kind of risk that is problematic here. It would be very easy if these files were made public for the administrative system that provided the data to us to re-identify the people in their system and get all of the additional information that we've collected through the surveys and through other linkages about those people. Now, while we don't assume that that information would be used for any administrative purpose, we are a statistical agency, and our data are only supposed to be used for statistical purposes. And all of our surveys are done on a volunteer basis, and we never want to even give the impression that it would be possible for an administrative use of the survey information that might put our survey respondents at risk of some kind of adverse effect. So one has to be very careful about re-identification by the providers of the administrative data, not only whether it actually would occur, but whether there is the impression that it might occur on the part of the survey participant that might lead them not to participate in the survey. And because of the highly identifiability of these files, most of our data products are available only through the NCHS Research Data Center or the other FSRDCs. And that certainly is a limitation to access, and we certainly realize that. And it's particularly a particular limitation for the linked files because they are so complex. They're longitudinal files, they have lots of different pieces. All of the different pieces have different quality characteristics. It takes a while to get to be good at using these files. And when you have to go to an RDC to use them, it does limit access. Next slide, please. So one of the things we've done, particularly with the linkages to the mortality files, which admittedly are in a sense the simplest linkage, is to put out two versions of the file. One, a restricted use file that you have to go to the RDC, and another, a public use version of the file. So for the restricted use file, all the dates are exact dates, and those are interview dates, birth dates, and death dates. This is a mortality file, so we have the cause of death, and the details underlying in multiple causes of death are on that file. All persons of all ages or decedents of all ages are on the file, and there is no perturbation of any data. That is the full file that you can access in the RDC. The public use version, on the other hand, does not include exact dates. Dates are represented either by quarter year or by person months of follow-up. There is a limited number of causes that are left on the file, particularly rare causes of death or less common causes of death are not on the file. They're blanked out. And there are flags, for example, for whether or not diabetes or hypertension is anywhere on the file, because we were told that that was an important thing to include. The file only has adults on it. And there is perturbation of cause of death and follow-up time for some decedents, but there is no perturbation of vital status. So if on the public use file, if someone is deceased, they are deceased on the restricted file as well. Next slide, please. So we think the maintenance of a public use version and a linked mortality file is extremely important for researchers. It gives them the ability, without coming to an RDC, to conduct some very basic analyses, get used to the file layout, and to do some kind of testing of whether or not their particular research project could be addressed by this file. They may be interested in looking at a particular cause of death that is rare, and the amount of survey people that we have in our files may not be large enough to give them a large enough sample of the outcome of interest. And they can find that out sometimes through the synthetic file. So we encourage users to use the synthetic file, do as much of their analysis as possible on that file so that when they come to the RDC, they can be very efficient, very quick, and they also will not start projects that they won't be able to finish because of the nature of the file. It's really necessary to do this. We go through, as I said, it's not the we is that Lisa. First, they identify the records that would be at risk for re-identification, and that's using pretty standard disclosure methodology. They then have to go perturb the date and cause of death where needed. And this is done in a way that maximizes the amount of data that can be released, rather than do it in a way where we would be suppressing things. We also want to provide the documentation to users so that they really do understand the comparability of the public and the restricted use files, so that they feel comfortable doing that. And so all of these files come with very extensive documentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is an example of evaluation that we do of the public and restricted use file. These are hazard ratios. So the first one is looking at the hazard of men, women, when the reference, the bars and dots, and file, and the one. The fact you see that the risk, and that's what we're trying to do with these synthetic files. We want to replicate what you would get if you had used the complete data set using more the blue one, the public use, the data set that has little.
Jennifer, can I stop you for just a minute? I am having a hard time hearing you. Could I send you the number to dial in? Because I think that'll help people hear you a little bit better. All right, I'm going to send that to you in the chat right now.
Can you hear me now, though? It's one more slide.
I do hear you, yes.
Let me try to finish.
Sure.
We're piloting some innovative ways to create fully synthetic public use files to improve accessibility and also reduce disclosure risk. And these will rely on statistical techniques to generate a much more protected file, but while maintaining the statistical distribution of the true data. This is going to be much more challenging than what we've already done. As I said, these survey files have hundreds of variables. The administrative files, other than mortality, have hundreds of variables. But this is where we're moving forward, and it's very similar, I think, to what Barry was talking about in terms of trying to create more synthetic files. Along with this, we're looking at privacy preserving record linkage algorithms to facilitate linkage, but that doesn't really address the disclosure issue. We are also trying to look at other mechanisms to increase access, but while maintaining the confidentiality of these highly identifiable files. And I really apologize for the connection problems. I am so sorry. That's it, Michael. Go ahead, take it back, please.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And I understand connection problems. So, all right. Just a reminder to everyone attending, if you have questions for Barry or Jennifer, please type them into the chat box. I'll be compiling them for the Q&A at the end. Our third speaker today is Ashley Landreth. Ashley has been at the U.S. Census Bureau for almost 22 years. She began her career there conducting qualitative research to improve survey questions and confidentiality messaging to respondents before moving to the production side of the agency to operationalize census residence rules, as well as to coordinate and deliver the apportionment results from the 2010 census. For the last 8 years, Ashley has served as a policy analyst focused on administering policy on the acquisition, access, and use of administrative data, as well as coordinating and negotiating agreements to bring in data to the Census Bureau. She also serves as the policy office representative on the Disclosure Review Board, the body that sets the confidentiality rules for all data products that the Census Bureau releases. Take it away, Ashley.
And hello, everybody. If I experience the dreaded computer voice, just let me know and I'll stop my video too. So I gave my slides a subtitle of Data Sharing Agreements in Practice because I'm going to look at some of the sessions issues from the perspective of the administrative data acquisition process as we know it at Census. Next slide, please. I'll walk through a few key agreement process steps, talk about what drives decisions on the appropriate use of the data, and mention a few topics included in our standard disclosure avoidance language for agreements that outlines our privacy protection strategies. And along the way, I'll point out where challenges tend to arise and wrap up by looking at future challenges for statistical agencies. Next slide. Generally speaking, agreements document our arrangement with other agencies or entities to use their their data, and this can happen at the federal, state, local government level, and we also work with nonprofits. The graphic that you're seeing very loosely and incompletely illustrates the agreement process from the beginning of the negotiation on the far left all the way through ingesting the data into our data warehouse on the far right. However, my focus will be on the areas in bold that are directly related to today's session. Next slide, please. Starting with the draft agreement column on the left. To determine if Census can work with another agency to pull in administrative data and use it, both parties have to find common ground in our respective laws, statutes, and policies that govern the data sharing and use. The statute that governs the Census Bureau, Title 13, allows us broad authority to bring in any administrative data for statistical use. But the question is, does our data provider have the legal latitude to share it? And if so, for what purpose? And data sharing can be vexing when the legal counsel representing a data provider interprets their statute more narrowly than maybe we would. And this comes into play a little bit where program and policy evaluation is concerned. This is where data sharing can get tricky because some data providers don't consider these activities to be statistical in nature. And to be fair, when statutes were first written decades ago, the idea of program and policy evaluation, which is a big part of the Evidence Act that Shelley's going to talk about, wasn't really even top of mind. So it wasn't called out explicitly as a data use. So sometimes that can be a barrier to sharing data. In terms of project approval mechanisms, there are data providers who sometimes would like the agreement to explicitly document each approved use of the data they want to share with us. And in those cases, the agreement does spell out a specific list of pre-specified projects with abstracts of the research proposal and the data sets that a researcher or a requester intends to use together. In cases where data providers are open to additional, but at the time when the agreement's first negotiated, unforeseen future requests for that same data, Census can incorporate and does incorporate a formal project approval process for the providing agency directly. Before I talk about how Census handles disclosure protections for its statistical products, it's helpful to remember that Census is poised to release its first major data product that uses differential privacy, the 2020 Census. But we aren't using this method yet for all of our statistical data products. Right now, we're using a suite of disclosure protection methods, and that includes what we call legacy methods. Those are outlined in the Statistical Policy Working Paper 22. We're also using noise injection to better protect geographic areas with small populations, and additional disclosure methods are added at the data provider's request. Census includes some standard disclosure language in all the acquisition agreements to document expectations around disclosure methods. And in addition, that language documents that all statistical products produced that are subject to Title 13, Section 9, confidentiality protections and other protections where appropriate. And the language also says that Census will define the disclosure methods and will also be responsible for carrying out that disclosure work. However, in the future, maybe our agreement partners would also want to review and approve statistical products prior to release. And in that case, we need to think through the implications for coordinating that effect. Moving over to the review and approval column on the right, the Disclosure Review Board, or the DRB, as we call it at Census, is the entity at Census that reviews all statistical products before release for adherence to appropriate disclosure avoidance methods to make sure that no person or business is identified. And over the last few years, the DRB has become a formal part, actually, of the agreement review and approval process. As disclosure procedures become more complex, the DRB wants to make sure the proposed end product associated with any particular agreement will meet the DRB's disclosure requirements so it can ultimately be released. And this review process helps manage expectations for all parties to the agreement and tends to head off any misunderstandings at the outset. For example, We bring in data for a particular project, and the correct disclosure methods are applied. But when it gets to the DRB for review, the DRB still finds some variable or result too disclosive. The product will have to be altered before it's approved and released. So we just like to let people know about that up front. Next slide, please. Here's the part where the future takes some creative thinking. In terms of statutes and data sharing, as statistical agencies, we're working toward more integration, but more is needed. Negotiating the terms and conditions of an agreement take a significant amount of time, and a year is not unusual. Multiple years aren't actually all that unusual either. Data providers' statutes differ from ours, and so do interpretations, which ultimately limits sharing. But what's the answer? Do we...
Ashley, we lost your audio. Ashley, can you hear us?
While she's connecting again, we've got a few questions in the chat box. Please continue to submit them. We'll keep compiling them.
Hello, can anybody hear me?
I hear you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so on the disclosure infrastructure front, there are two looming issues that I was thinking about. First, from the Census Bureau's perspective, we're protecting the data so that no single person or business can be re-identified, but currently it's difficult to make sure that there are no other administrative data out there that would cause a product to be disclosive. We do try to look for those, but it's difficult to coordinate. The second issue is scalability. Right now, the census carries out the disclosure work entirely on its own, but as more administrative data is combined, the Census Bureau's DRB may be asked to review and approve output from other agencies' projects, especially in cases where data is shared between us. And while the DRB can handle a modest uptick in workload, any more than that would quickly become overwhelming. So what's the solution? Right now, a census executive body is deciding the amount of privacy to be applied to the 2020 census, and then the DRB is going to carry that out. The census sees this as a policy decision, and so maybe similarly in the future, decisions about disclosure methodology may need to be negotiated by executive bodies that are then handed off to DRBs or reviewers at statistical units. This type of framework would be useful to our DRB in the future, but maybe even now, because they currently manage a complex suite of disclosure requirements in order to meet our own needs and those of other agencies. And it would be great if we could establish common ground on privacy protection standards across all the DRBs in the federal statistical system. Maybe Shelley will tell us there's going to be an OMB-led executive body. We'll see, because she's next. Next slide, please. That's it for me. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. And okay, our final speaker today is Shelley Wilkie-Martinez. Shelley is a senior statistician at the Office of Management and Budget, the Statistical and Science Policy Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, where she provides leadership to the Federal Data Strategy, the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, FCSM, and the cross-OMB team implementing the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. She returned to OMB in late 2017 after 15 months as the executive director of the statutorily created Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. Ms. Martinez was an early member of OMB's evidence team and led major data quality improvement efforts in the areas of criminal justice, education, and federal program evaluation. Ms. Martinez also led early interagency efforts to transform and expand the Census Bureau's Research Data Centers program into a federal statistical system-wide shared service. Prior to joining OMB, Shelley spent 10 years at the U.S. Census Bureau and nearly 8 years on Capitol Hill. She is an elected fellow of the American Statistical Association. Take it away, Shelley.
Shelley, we actually are not hearing you right now. Sorry to pause you. I mean, I can see that you're talking, but could you push *6 on your phone? I think that should unmute you. I see you're talking, and I still don't hear you.
While we're waiting for Shelley to get connected, we have a short question for Ashley that I think we might be able to answer in the lull here. Ashley, a question came in from Catherine Wallman asking what you meant by an executive body. Can you maybe say a few words?
Sure, I should have made that clearer. It's a loose thought. It's maybe even just a hope that perhaps there, like the Census Bureau has the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, so that's an executive body that is deciding how much privacy budget to give to the 2020 census and will decide other privacy budgets, and then the DRB will carry that out. I'm aware that we have DRBs at several other federal statistical agencies, and coordinating some disclosure methodology, but also privacy loss budgets, perhaps, if we get to use differential privacy for administrative data in the future, could sort of be the arbiter among the federal statistical agencies, kind of like the ICSP, is a body that helps coordinate all of our federal agencies. So something like that, someone to take the lead and say everybody should be using this, and so that's what I was thinking. And I hope folks in the audience who have even better ideas will help workshop this idea or say that it's a really bad idea.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. And it looks like we have Shelley back online. So, Shelley, if you're there, we'll turn it over to you.
Yep. Let me ask if you can hear me.
We can.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So, briefly, a main contribution I hope I can make today is to discuss briefly how the new law that Michael mentioned, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, anticipates and addresses some of the challenges we've been talking today. It doesn't make it easy. A lot of hard issues have been raised today, but we do have an approach in the law, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I imagine many of you know something about the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. I'll call it Evidence Act from here on out for brevity. So today I'm going to focus really just on Title III, which is a major update to U.S. statistical law, and I'm going to, with apologies in advance, just fly through the other parts of the law for kind of thematic coherence. Next slide, please. So when we talk at OMB about the Evidence Act, we talk about the three big ideas that roughly correspond to the three titles in the law. So the first big idea is that if we want more use, some more creation and use of evidence in our country, in our government, and in private decision making, then we need to be intentional and have a systematic approach to the creation and use of evidence. You'll hear about things like learning agendas, for example, some of the requirements in the first title. And then the second title sort of recognizes that data are an essential element of evidence building, and that data need management and stewardship, and there's a lot of focus on those things in the second title of the law, including this idea that data should be made public and open whenever possible. And certainly we have a lot of data in our government that don't have any sorts of privacy or confidentiality limitations and can, of course, be made completely open. And then we like to talk about when data can't be made publicly available. That's where the third title or the third big idea kind of comes into play. And this is the idea that when data very appropriately are collected under restrictions, under confidentiality promises and so forth, that we want a way to safely and appropriately still expand access to data so that we can do more and better evidence building. So those are the three big ideas. Next slide, please. Let me drill down into that third title just a little bit. So I've got myself all messed up here in terms of my setup here. Let me pull up the, okay. I go faster if I use a few notes for reference instead of freelancing here. So there's a lot in the third title of the Evidence Act, and I'm not going to do it all justice. But there are some important concepts here about frameworks. And I think the key idea here is that Title III of the Evidence Act, which is really a big reauthorization and update to CIPSE, the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act, that this section of the law gives common frameworks for statistical agencies to be the providers of access to data for evidence building, and by giving them more in the way of common frameworks to do that, in some ways is pushing more evidence building through that aperture, and therefore presumably less through other venues such as program agencies doing it themselves without necessarily all of the infrastructure that the law gives to statistical agencies. So briefly, kind of the storyline here, the way I understand it, is that the law creates this idea of the trusted intermediary, which is the statistical agencies and units that OMB under the law recognizes as being eligible, if you will, under CIPSE. So these trusted intermediaries then have a set of responsibilities because of this sort of exclusive status that they have as being allowed to use CIPSE confidentiality authority to protect data that they acquire. So some of this is not new, but Congress asked that this be more formalized and more more standardized, I should say, a more standardized process for recognizing agencies and units. And then once they are recognized, the law takes a relatively new policy at OMB, the Statistical Policy Directive 1, which is about fundamental responsibilities of a statistical agency, and codifies those responsibilities in law. So statistical agencies must be relevant, credible, objective, and maintain confidentiality and trust, and then ask OMB to regulate on that provision. So once strengthened in these ways, the idea is that these intermediaries are given a really amazing new authority called presumption of accessibility, which is a powerful tool for overcoming some of the cultural, policy, and other barriers that you heard Ashley and others talk about when it comes to negotiating for access to administrative data. So literally this provision says that every agency of government shall make data accessible to a statistical agency, a recognized statistical agency, upon request, with some exceptions, which we will obviously be getting into when that is regulated. But it's a pretty powerful provision, and it gives statistical agencies needed access to modernize their own programs, but it also anticipates them being able to request and access data to help with all types of evidence building, including things like federal program evaluation. So in this way, this infrastructure is being built up to put more through the aperture of the statistical agencies. And how will we make all this data available? How will we do this? So again, this idea of common frameworks, the law then has this idea of statistical agencies all using a common application process. So think of it as a common front door or kind of a front end. So in the future, that's something we're building now. Statistical agencies will all provide access, or not provide access, we will all use a common application form, which will allow researchers to not necessarily have to know in advance which agency they're working with, but will come to a common place where they can request access to data, and we will all use a common process, including a common appeals process, so the research community is interfacing with us more as a system as opposed to individuals. And I think that provides a lot of opportunities to kind of centralize what we know about who is accessing restricted data and so on and so forth. And then lastly, and really importantly, is this additional framework idea, which is that statistical agencies will then provide the restricted data access or provide access to data through a common framework. There'll be a common sensitivity framework to kind of rate or somehow define the sensitivity amount or level of different data files. And of course, identifiability would seem to be an important element of sensitivity. So with this common sensitivity framework, then we would use a common data access framework, which many of us think of as sort of a tiered access approach. So these two frameworks sort of interact. And then through this tiered access framework, which of course is designed to make sure that we have data accessible not just fully open or fully sort of locked down in an enclave, but that there are intermediate methods. I think some of the things Barry mentioned about synthetic data, for example, query systems, some of our squidgens we use are good examples of things in those middle tiers. So we would have all of these different access mechanisms that we would use in a common framework, common vocabulary, common sensitivity of ratings or definitions. And then lastly, there'd be a common risk assessment process, which is what I think of as what we do today in terms of statistical disclosure limitation. But again, we would have a standardized approach to that we would all be using. So again, that last part is a lot. It's probably, in my mind, the most complex thing in the Evidence Act. Something we're going to have to learn how to do over time. But the idea is that it really does give us this common platform that we can all be coordinating more effectively to manage access and disclosure risk. I think I'll stop there and turn it back over to Michael.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. And again, please submit your questions via the chat box. I've seen a few more come in. So now we're going to turn things over to discussion. So I'll start with just a general question for all of the panelists. How do you see that you've named a number of challenges at your respective agencies in your presentations? How do you see these challenges evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? Like, if you could peer into your crystal ball, are these challenges going to get easier? Are we going to be able to deal with them? Are they going to get more complex? What are your thoughts? Don't everybody speak at once.
This is Jennifer, Michael. I'll start.
Jennifer, there you go.
Okay, yeah, no, I think they're going to get more difficult because just the amount of information out there is growing and people's sophistication is growing. And I think Ashley mentioned that, it's kind of hard even for our DRBs now to know exactly what the risks might be. So I think because we're going to go through this period where it's going to get harder, there's going to have to be some kind of meeting of that with some more work in trying to develop new and perhaps very different kinds of ways to address those challenges. Because I think many of the other things that have been mentioned, like our DRBs are already overworked and can't take much more. So even if we had perfect disclosure review, we'd probably be really slow in doing it.
Yeah, so I'll just agree with Jennifer completely. I think it's going to get harder, not easier. One factor that we haven't really talked about is the fact that many of our agencies that deal with traditional survey-based statistical gathering are facing challenges of their own trying to gather information in that way. The costs are going up, the response rates are going down. We all know that story. And so they are going to be looking to increase their use of administrative data beyond where it's being used now. So, for instance, Census is looking at new ways to use the tax data that my organization provides more directly in its data production side, whereas in the past those data were really limited to sampling frames and post sampling kinds of adjustments. So I do think that the stress on our DRBs and the whole system trying to go about this would have been going about it is going to just continue to mount. And I think, sort of thinking about not just the problem but the solution, I think what that means for us is that we need to start educating users that we need to build multiple access tiers, which Shelley and I have both mentioned now, and also which have come up in some other talks as well. And we need to start educating the user community to nudge them to use those tools. And I think that one of the ways to do that is to make them easier to access than some of these other modes. We've talked about how long it can take to get a project approved, for instance, but if you can submit a query to a database and get back the answer you need in an automated fashion, that would be much easier. Or if you can use a synthetic data set to do 90% of your work and then just validate it, by interacting with the real data, I think that would be attractive to data users. So if we can start working with our user communities now to teach them that there is life beyond just direct access to microdata files for many purposes, I think that can help solve some of these problems. But I think we need to be very thoughtful about how we design those systems so that they are attractive and easy to use and do solve user problems.
Ashley or Shelley, did you want to add anything?
Or hopefully I'm unmuted.
We can hear you, Ashley.
Okay, great. I couldn't agree more. I think, there's going to have to be an incredible investment in disclosure infrastructure and staff to support it, and a much greater coordination effort among our DRBs, so that we're harmonizing on methodology and figuring out how to best protect the administrative data that we're all using. And I know there are visionaries in the audience, and so when there's audience Q&A, maybe that will come out too.
And a reminder to submit your questions. Oh yeah, Barry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say this might be a good time to note the work that you're leading, Michael, to produce an update to what was traditionally called Working Paper 22 by moving disclosure guidance and best practices to a web-based availability, and to accompany that with a toolkit. Because I mentioned earlier, in thinking about the wide range of administrative data users, because right now we really seem to have honed in on just the research folks. But you got to remember, as I tried to show, that there are a lot of administrative data users who are not what we think of as a traditional research community. And so I think it's going to be really important for not only to expand the capacity of our DRBs, but also that we offer easy-to-use tools for the less sophisticated users that we have, or they're not going to be able to keep up with the requirements that we may be trying to implement to protect the administrative data that are being used very broadly. So the toolkit that you are and your team are starting to roll out, I think are going to be really front and center as we think about how we protect administrative data moving forward.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up, Barry. For those who aren't familiar, so the Data Protection Toolkit is a project being overseen by the federal. Oh, go ahead. No, I think I heard somebody. The Data Protection Toolkit is a project being coordinated by the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, and the idea behind it is to take the very useful and valuable content that was previously included in Statistical Policy Working Paper 22 and expand upon it, update it to deal with new techniques and technologies that have been emerging, but more importantly to provide this online repository of tools that agencies and our peers in other countries and elsewhere have already developed to address many of these complex issues, particularly automated tools for performing disclosure limitation, automated tools for assessing disclosure risk, as well as governance documents that agencies can use as models. And I think the real importance there, and this is what Barry was getting at, was that there is a wide diversity in the maturity level of disclosure review boards or the entities within agencies that are responsible for performing disclosure review. And the statistical agencies largely have invested a lot over the years in putting together their DRBs and invested in developing thorough and usable tools to perform disclosure review. But a lot of agencies either don't have the resources for this or don't even know where to begin. And so the idea behind the toolkit was to allow other agencies that are just beginning to set up a DRB or wanting to improve the role of their DRBs, give them the tools they need. Jennifer, were you going to add something?
Yeah, just talk about the differential privacy having a disclosure budget. Well, we also have data collection and dissemination budgets. And I remember, I've been doing this a long time, that when the majority of our data budget went towards data collection, the dissemination part was really quite minimal. There was a lot of tables. You needed a huge computer to analyze a microfile. I think over time we've pushed more money into the dissemination side and away from the collection side, and all the things that Ashley and Barry and you've talked about are going to require even more investment in making data more available, and that unfortunately leaves less for the basic collection, especially from those of us who are, for better or worse, kind of stuck with surveys because there aren't a whole lot of administrative sources that we can use for some of our needs. So it's kind of more of a, where are we in a much broader sense in our ability to meet data needs very broadly, both from what we can collect and how do we disseminate it. We can't solve just that one problem because it'll make a problem somewhere else down in the system.
And that echoes the comments that Ashley was making earlier about the need to invest in staff and infrastructure for performing these. I think that was a very valid point. Recognizing the time, I want to make sure we get some of the audience questions answered, and please continue to submit those. So we've got a question for Jennifer from Keenan Duarte-Fisher. Are disclosure reviews of outputs from the restricted use files targeted to the affected variables, for example, date and cause of death? And are there pitfalls to avoid besides those that would obscure the restricted use file variables themselves?
I'm not quite sure I understand the second part, Keenan, but the first part. Once an analysis is done in the RDC, the kind of output you're reviewing is very different than what you would review on a microfile. So there, it's a unit record. You have to worry about certain demographic characteristics match with the cause of death, particularly because many death announcements are in the newspaper, and so a lot of it is very public. So the things you look at when you would look at a microfile in terms of the demographics might be very different than when you're looking at output from the RDC, which may be model based. And so sometimes you're not so worried about those small demographic cells unless it's tabular data, and then we have different kinds of mechanisms. But most of the time it's some kind of model data, and that concern with those very small cells sometimes gets lost, so you don't have to worry about it so much. I think that we're always looking for different ways to do the perturbation. What's the best way where you get the most protection for the least change in the data? I think in general we tend to target the demographics or the variables that we know are going to be the highest probability of re-identification, and for that particular file it tends to be exact dates and these. It's not. We're not worried about the major causes. There's lots of heart disease deaths, but if you're looking at some of the more rare causes, and you have the demographics, sometimes. I'm usually the test case. If I can figure out how to do the identification, then everybody agrees that that's we're putting out too much data.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Another question here. This one's probably for Shelley. This is from T. Lee. Is there a difference between statistical units and statistical agencies in terms of standard application processes?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think the downside of going quickly is I used a little bit too much shorthand. SIPC, the Evidence Act, actually uses the phrase statistical agencies and units. And I don't believe the law differentiates between the two. So sometimes we shorthand that to statistical agencies, but it's a good point that we have some organizations in government that you might think of more like a unit that have been recognized by OMB as part of the SIPC family. So they too would be subject to or covered by the provisions that I was talking about earlier. So I would say the two are really equated in the law.
Great, thanks, Shelley. We got another question for Ashley here from Nina Cross. Nina says that she works for a longitudinal survey study for which the data is protected under a certificate of confidentiality. If she wants to link to census data and get a resulting file that can be used in the research data centers, is this linked file still protected from subpoenas and court orders under the certificate of confidentiality? And she stresses this is something that she's trying to figure out right now prior to drafting informed consent for her survey participants. Ashley, are you there?
Did I unmute this time?
Now we can hear you, yes.
Okay. So that's a good question. And what I think I'm hearing is when an external researcher might want to bring in data that they've collected, and then link it with Title 13 protected data. And I think we'd have to look at your certificate to say for sure, and we would do that as part of our project or proposal review process. But I think a couple of things should be pointed out when an external researcher comes in and they bring their own data. What's protected is the Title 13 data. So when that data is linked to Title 13 data, then that file is protected by Title 13 confidentiality protections and can't be subpoenaed. But I am not as sure about your longitudinal data you're talking about.
Great, thanks, Ashley. All right, so we have one more question here from Adeline Wilcox. And this might be for any of our participants, but I'll tee it up maybe for Barry to speak to first. She asks, to at least some degree or another, can the big data people get past differential privacy or other disclosure avoidance methods that the Census Bureau might apply? Barry, you had mentioned the IRS was looking into differential privacy. What's your opinion? And then maybe I'll turn to Ashley for her to give hers.
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Do they mean, are there big data methods that would negate the differential privacy solution or process to be able to allow folks to re-identify people? I think the answer to that, and John Abel's on this, he could speak as well to this, but I believe my understanding is if you apply differential privacy methods using the formal process, then the data are protected against any known computer attack as far as being able to reconstruct that database. I think that the appeal of a differential privacy approach for protecting data is that you can mathematically demonstrate that it's not possible to identify any individual in a data set if you apply the process correctly. Now, if you there are hybrids, I'm sure, that would probably create chinks in the armor, but that's my understanding of the process. So if that's the question, I think the answer is that differential privacy is supposed to be airtight in that way, both to attacks now and attacks in the future, and that's the appeal of that approach for protecting data.
If I could add on to what you said, Barry, and then maybe qualify a bit, this is echoed by Bill Davies' comment in the chat box. Any release of data that's derived from a confidential source is going to leak a little bit of that private information in the process. There's no such thing as a risk-free publication of data that was derived from confidential sources. So kind of qualifying what you said, Barry, differential privacy doesn't guarantee that you can't re-identify anybody. It establishes through that privacy loss budget, which you and others mentioned, it establishes that maximum amount of leakage that could occur, and in doing so establishes what the precise privacy guarantee that you're affording to the respondents is, and that could be high or could be low, depending on how you set that privacy loss budget, but it guarantees that you're never going to exceed that much risk. So, Ashley, did you want to add anything, or?
To let the experts hash this out.
Okay, and John Abel just chimed in. Barry is correct. Long paragraph with the nuances. So, all right. Turning to another question, and again, if any of the attendees would like to submit questions, please put them in the chat box. We have about 13 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question to Shelley. So data protection and the things we've been talking about today are important topics for the Interagency Council on Statistical Policy, ICSP. What are some of their recent or upcoming initiatives on this issue, and kind of what role could we see them playing in this longer term?
Thanks for the question, Michael. Barry's actually a member of the council, so I feel a little sheepish answering the question, but I'll start maybe and see if he wants to correct me. So as Michael knows, we actually just recently have shared a little bit of information with the Statistical Council about the latest progress on the data protection toolkit. And I think it's fair to say that our council, which, as some of you may know, is comprised of not only the heads of the statistical agencies, but also a statistical official from each of the large cabinet level agencies, so 24 statistical officials. They have certain responsibilities under the Evidence Act and under OMB policy for the Evidence Act. One of those responsibilities is to oversee the development of confidentiality standards for their departments and agencies. It's not something that has a deadline, but it is something that I think some of our statistical officials are beginning to think about, and we would expect the data protection toolkit to be hopefully a very important input, a very good resource for them as they begin that process. And normally when we talk about the Evidence Act and have a little more time, we focus on the fact that we have these statistical officials, but we also have chief data officers and evaluation officials, and there, of course, are pre-existing officials at agencies prior to the Evidence Act, like our senior agency officials for privacy. So there's a whole host of folks who are relevant to departmental conversations about data protection and confidentiality. And our OMB policy actually sort of set forth the idea that these folks would sit together on a data governance board at their departments. So I think that gives us a nice venue that statistical officials can really leverage at their departments to begin conversations that are coordinated. So it's not just coordinating across the statistical agencies, which is critical, but also coordinating across these programmatic and support offices at their departments. So I see the Statistical Council kind of facilitating for its members work in this area in the coming months. And so, Michael, I think that's, probably the most specific thing where the data protection toolkit will be used, and this opportunity to really have conversations, particularly with chief data officers and privacy officials, will be, I hope, really fruitful as we think this through. Barry, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just echo what you said. I think that that's right. I think that one of the real gems that the statistical system has is the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology, which is sponsoring this webinar. That group has the ability to go out and take on new projects, and I think that there are opportunities for us as a system to sponsor additional work in particular areas of privacy protection, either in helping to advance work in differential privacy, or perhaps looking at other limitation methods. I think there's also we had a really interesting talk about a year and a half ago on secure multi-party computing, and I'd like to see if it's not possible to get a pilot of that going between a couple of the agencies. That doesn't solve the problem, so much the problem of disclosure. It can help address that in some cases, but I think it also helps us think about the cybersecurity and just the mechanics of how we can bring data together from multiple agencies in an efficient and low-cost way. So I think there's some work that we could do there to try to pilot and see what's possible. So I think that those kind of small first step kind of initiatives are things that we can, as a group, look at trying to advance. And then just using the forum as an opportunity to share as we all learn and advance in this area, so that we're not each person isn't having to reinvent the wheel, so to speak, as each agency tries to move forward.
Great, thank you both. So another question here. Much of the coordination that each of you have discussed between agencies on these issues takes the form of interagency memoranda of understanding. And I think that the prevailing view of the MOU process is that it's often cumbersome and time-consuming. So if MOUs need to have better provisions and mechanisms to govern these issues, to ensure better coordination of disclosure review and disclosure control for these shared data, how, from your own experiences, how do you think that could be streamlined? Ashley, do you want to start, and then maybe Barry or Jennifer could chime in?
Sure, I think that's the $64 million question. Because right now there's no arbiter to help agencies come to some agreement when there are different ideas on both sides. So without that role, I'm not sure you can streamline the negotiation. And legal counsel at various agencies, can be vastly different. So while some are more in a supportive role when these negotiations happen, they make sure everything is adhering to law once the negotiation is done or along the way. Other agencies like their legal counsel to take, full charge of writing the agreements themselves and then float them down to staff. So yeah, there's a lot of different approaches out there. I'm interested to see what everybody else has to say about, their ideas for streamlining the MOU process.
So, you say that different agencies sometimes have different legal teams, but within the same agency, we have had issues where one year a certain agreement is signed and there's a change in the council, and when you try to renew it 2 or 3 years later, it's no longer fine. So the amount of interpretation of the law is clearly very fluid and flexible, making doing these agreements very difficult. There was a push several years ago to get a kind of a standard agreement up front that we would all agree to use. That never really happened, I think, for all of these reasons. So without some pressure from somewhere else, and I say this with a little bit of concern, I don't see our current system changing very much. Just because of the way it's embedded in our different agencies, with not only no common understanding of the interpretation, but no common agreement on some of the things like, well, how do you handle the linked file when it's linked? And so we, like Census Bureau, if we link a file and ours is protected under CIPC and 308D, that whole file is protected that way. But now you have to then negotiate access to that, and there's no agreement on how to do that either. So these are not technical issues. I think these are more policy issues that are going to have to be dealt with at a policy level.
So, Shelley, this sounds like it might be a role for OMB in its efforts to implement the Evidence Act. Can you give any hopeful insight into the future there?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking when I heard the question that that's why I think some of us who have been sort of studying the Evidence Act and thinking about the possibility of the vision behind it get pretty excited. The authority I mentioned called presumption of accessibility is, SIPC was designed, as we all know, to be sort of this common legal framework that statistical agencies could all use to protect data, a common framework to use to have agents, such as researchers, access data, and so forth. And because the new law builds on that, we now have this common authority that all statistical agencies and units could use to acquire data. And if everyone's using the same authority to acquire data, and this is through an OMB regulation, you could imagine guidance, sub-regulatory guidance, that lays out these standard approaches, standard templates, and so forth. And I think that's very much a vision and a goal people have, is to say when statistical agencies are using this common authority, and we are in the regulation, we would be speaking to the statistical agency role, but we would also be speaking to the role of the program agencies who are on the receiving end of these requests. So both parties under this regulation could be instructed or encouraged, at least, to use a common MOU framework. So I think that is very much in the realm of possibility, and I think that's the power of using this common authority in the future.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to see how that plays out. All right. Well, we are almost at the end of our time, and I want to let each of the panelists just say a few words on kind of their suggestions or recommendations to those who might be listening, who are facing these challenges themselves and maybe haven't put as much thought into how to address them. So maybe going in presenter order, starting with Barry, if you could just, what would your big takeaways for agencies that are struggling with this? How would you suggest they wrap their heads around these issues?
Well, at the risk of being redundant, I think that for folks who haven't had a chance to think through these issues, I think using the tools that your team is about to release, I think will provide a good foundation for understanding some of the approaches that other agencies are taking, what's working. I think the nice thing about the toolkit is that it's going to talk about the weaknesses and the strengths of all the different approaches to disclosure limitation. And so that'll help people to match their risk with the tool that they want to use. I think at the same time, we need to all continue to work together to advance the work in this area so that we are continually improving what we can do, and that the methods that we have out there are more sophisticated, are increasing in sophistication while listening to our users, because I think that's the important sort of third leg of the stool, if you will. We really need to make sure that as we do all of this to the data, we're meeting our user expectations and creating products that can be used. And in thinking about the solutions, again, I do think some sort of tiered structure and a strong education component or incentive program to direct users to the correct tier, I think is going to be really important as we move forward and think about how we can both increase the use of data for evidence and evaluation while increasing the protection that we're offering to the data sets.
Great, thank you. Jennifer?
Now, if you're a data producer and having to deal with some of these things, then certainly the toolkit that your group has developed, Michael, is a good place to start. If you're not within a statistical agency, then I would contact a statistical agency in your department and talk to them about how they do it and what kind of tools do they have available, because you are probably going to be in the same kind of data. Most of the statistical agencies do have very well documentation for how they work, and they'll be happy to talk to you, I hope, about the process. And, you can take a lot of what they do and apply it. If you're on the user side, I would echo what Barry said. It's, part of our challenge is that we have a very wide range of users. So if we target a product for one set of users, it likely will not meet the needs of another set of users, because we are especially, we think of our health data collection as it's all over the place. It's risk factors, it's mortality, it's conditions, it's healthcare, it's insurance. And some people interested in race, and some people interested in urban rural. And so there's a lot going on there. But if we don't hear from the users, we don't know how to make decisions about where to put emphasis. But it's kind of maybe Barry said this in a positive way, and maybe this is like a reality check, that the complete unfettered access to all the microdata on your laptop forever is probably not going to be the way of the future. And there was a place in time when we were releasing a whole lot more data, and that's come less and less. So if we are going to have to create different methods of access, whether you do go to the RDC and you get everything you want, or these kind of query tools or synthetic data, we may be entering a time when you might have to use multiple products, where before you could just use one. And I think the key is to try to create those products so that they meet as many needs as possible with as few barriers as possible, realizing that the perfect here is not going to happen. And so we just want to get as close to it as we can. And we can't do that without a lot of conversation.
Important points. Ashley, your final thoughts?
I'm interested to see what comes out of the data protection toolkit as well. I think that's going to be a great resource for people. But just from my perspective, as somebody who sits in the policy office at Census and sees a lot of MOUs, we have public-facing templates for agreements. If anybody's interested to see what that language looks like, we have that. And my contact information was on the last slide of my presentation. So please feel free to reach out if you're in the audience wondering about agreements or something having to do with the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board. I can always pass on questions or information. And thanks for having the session today.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Shelley, last but certainly not least.
Thanks. So I like the way the previous speakers kind of talked about the data producers and the data users as two distinct communities that could be on this call today. I think if you're someone in the federal government or someone who supports the federal government through contracting and so forth, it's a big place. So I think we can all use your help getting the word out about some of these resources and some of the opportunities to collaborate. Almost never a day goes by where I don't have an email or a conversation with someone who doesn't know about Working Paper 22 or doesn't know about Michael's committee that is actually an open interest group that anybody in the federal government can be part of and use as a support mechanism when they're trying to deal with disclosure issues, et cetera, et cetera. So, help us get the word out that as Jennifer said, there is a statistical agency in many cabinet departments. There are statistical officials in every cabinet department. Michael's group is a resource. So let's try to help our colleagues not reinvent the wheel or work at cross purposes with what we're all trying to do. That in and of itself, I think, will help. It's going to take a while for everyone to understand the coordination opportunities that exist, and that's going to strengthen, I think, everyone's efforts. And then for our data stakeholder community, no one has had the opportunity on this call to mention our upcoming advisory committee on data for evidence building, which Barry will be a member. But that's another place for this conversation to continue, and I think we expect that committee to seek public comment and feedback on some of the challenges that the unfinished business of the Evidence Act, if you will, where we might have more or additional legal or policy issues, but then also sort of the practical things we've started to talk about today. What needs to happen? Like, how do we boost this capacity for DRBs and so forth? What are some of the big system-wide projects or ideas that need to be developed? And I think the advisory committee will be a place where a lot of those really interesting conversations are happening, and that's going to be largely in the public eye because it is an advisory committee. So encourage everybody to consider contributing to that effort. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Shelley. I for one, am very eager to hear what the advisory committee has to say and what they end up recommending. So I encourage everybody to stay tuned and keep an eye on that. So this concludes our webinar today. On behalf of FCSM and COPAS, I want to thank our presenters for the enlightening discussion today, and I'd like to thank all of those who attended, and to invite all of you to attend our upcoming 8th webinar in this Confidentiality and Data Access series, which will be a panel discussion on reducing barriers to researcher access, and we'll touch on many of these tiered data access topics that have been brought up in discussion today. That webinar is going to be on Thursday, October 15th, so in 2 weeks at 3:00 p.m. Hope you'll be able to join us for what promises to be another important discussion. And with that, I will conclude today, and thank you all for being here.